Okay, let's jump right in. We've had a question come through from you, the listener, and it really gets to the core of the recovery experience, basically. How do you actually handle those really intense, scorching emotions, things like pure fury, deep frustration, especially now that alcohol, that old coping mechanism, is off the table?
Hmm.
So the question really boils down to, is it okay to feel angry in sobriety? I mean, we're talking about real rage, that blinding frustration, the conflict that maybe you used to either just stuff down or, well, let explode after a few drinks.
Right.
And now the anesthesia's gone, right? The volume knob is cranked way up on everything. So where
Yeah.
does all that explosive energy go? And maybe more importantly, how do we stop it from just dragging us right back into that spiral, towards relapse?
It's such a critical topic for a deep dive
Yeah.
because historically the answer is pretty stark, isn't it? Unmanaged anger, and
Yeah.
especially its festering cousin, resentment. Well, they're often called fatal obstacles in recovery.
Fatal obstacles. Wow.
Yeah, if these huge emotions are just left to run wild, they pretty much guarantee you'll end up isolated
Right.
again and, well, eventually back drinking. One of the biggest surprises for people when they first stop drinking is realizing the suffering didn't actually stop.
Right. The emotional stuff is still there.
Exactly. The turmoil, the unhappiness,
Mm.
it often keeps going because the
Ye-
person is still, swimming in self-pity and, yep, that really deep-seated resentment.
Okay, so our mission today then is to kind of get beyond just the feeling of I'm angry and really dig into the tools that classic recovery wisdom offers. Find a constructive way forward. We're going to unpack how these processes, like the self-inventory, that really rigorous search for truth, how they can actually give us usable, practical tools. Tools to identify, understand, and then process this really destructive emotional energy in a, well, constructive way. We need emotional mastery, right? Not just stopping drinking.
Exactly.
Hmm?
Emotional mastery.
Yeah.
And for this, we've looked at insights from, the foundational 12-step literature, but also brought in some contemporary recovery texts.
Okay.
So we're kind of blending the practical steps, the real how-to stuff, with some more modern psychological takes on emotion, addiction, and crucially self-honesty.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, that deep self-audit, that honesty, it's a life-saving tool for emotional regulation.
Life-saving, okay. Let's start there then, maybe looking back. Before sobriety really took hold, what was that mechanism? How did alcohol help manage, I'm using air quotes here, those feelings, especially conflict and frustration?
Well, it was a deceptively simple formula, really,
Yeah.
almost like a chemical contract. It was
Wow.
basically repression plus drink.
Seeming openness.
Repression plus drink equals openness.
Yeah, think of it like chemical permission. So when you were sober, maybe you'd push down feelings of unhappiness or avoid conflict. You'd stifle them, lock them away.
Right. But then alcohol comes along, and it just sort of dissolves those barriers, just for a bit. And it gives you this false sense of permission to finally express those feelings.
Whether that was like crying fits or shouting matches or...
Exactly. Tears, aggression, explosive rage, you name it. Whatever was bottled up gets uncorked chemically.
And that inability to just sit with the feeling. That's huge, isn't it? That raw, uncomfortable feeling of frustration or sadness. It just felt intolerable without that chemical buffer.
Absolutely. I remember hearing someone describe it as just not being able to sit still with their own thoughts for even 10 minutes. Always needing that anesthesia, as you called it, of a drink.
Yeah.
And that's where the real danger lies, because you start mistaking that temporary chemical release for, like, genuine emotional expression, or even worse, thinking you've somehow mastered your emotions.
You confuse the short circuit with insight.
You got it. But the reality is, constantly mismanaging and repressing this inner stuff, this conflict, it leads to devastating emotional consequences, even physical ones eventually.
Okay, you mentioned serious emotional consequences. Can we dig into that a bit? Like beyond just feeling moody or irritable, what actually happens when these feelings keep getting pushed down or mismanaged? What are the real stakes?
Oh, the stakes are incredibly high.
Mm.
We're not just talking about being a bit grumpy. Unmanaged repression can lead straight into feelings of just extreme hopelessness, despair, really.
Wow.
And psychologically, this can show up as profound emotional instability.
Yeah.
That might mean, debilitating clinical depression or acute paranoia, a crippling fear of actually going insane, losing touch with reality.
That's terrifying.
It is. And tragically, sometimes it even leads to the emergence of suicidal thoughts or even homicidal thoughts or feelings. These are the really severe outcomes of what's called emotional unmanageability. the mind just, it can't sustain that level of internal conflict without something breaking.
And even if it doesn't get to those extremes, just the day-to-day psychological weight of that constant inner conflict, it must be exhausting.
Utterly exhausting. Yeah.
Mm.
Imagine someone who's constantly putting up this painful front. Maybe they're stuck in a job they hate or a relationship dynamic that's just destructive.
Right.
That person is living in this perpetual state of inner conflict, like a quiet civil war inside them. But because it's repressed, often they're not even aware of where it's coming from.
Mm.
And this constant repressed tension creates this debilitating feeling of being trapped, just completely stuck.
And that trapped feeling.
Yeah.
That's the perfect setup for wanting to escape, right?
Exactly. It's the perfect fuel for that intense urge to just forget your troubles, numb out with intoxication. The addiction becomes the escape hatch from that emotional exhaustion.
And then say someone manages to stop drinking, achieves abstinence, but they haven't yet found the tools to actually deal with that underlying conflict. The emotional volatility can just be scary.
Oh, absolutely. We see this in the source materials. There are stories, anecdotes of just sheer emotional chaos, even in early sobriety. Well, there's one story of someone who was sober, but got into this huge, volatile argument with their partner, screaming, shouting, and their baby was right there in the room.
Oh, wow.
And the chilling moment wasn't even the fight itself. It was the sudden realization, the dawning horror that their uncontrolled emotional outburst was terrifying their family.
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment of rage, this person realized, I am completely replaceable here.
Yeah.
And that the desperate need for real fundamental change was rooted right there in that destructive anger they just couldn't control.
That really hits home. And it leads us straight to why unmanaged negative emotion is such a direct pipeline back to relapse. If you don't get a handle on the inner conflict,
You run straight back to the old solution.
Yeah.
Becomes this really predictable, grim cycle.
How does that cycle work?
Well, you've got this constant internal battle, right?
Right.
That leads to what you could call willpower fatigue. You just get worn down. That fatigue breeds bitterness, deep unhappiness. So inevitably, when the person breaks their abstinence, that first drink feels like this amazing relief. It feels intensely pleasurable.
The forbidden fruit thing.
Exactly. The forbidden fruit syndrome. Because the time spent abstaining was so physically and emotionally draining, the relief feels huge. But it's immediately followed by this crushing regret.
The guilt.
The guilt, the shame, which then forces the person to drink even more just to numb that feeling. And boom, the cycle accelerates again.
And there's a biological piece here too, isn't there? Which I think is so important for you listening. Why just not drinking feels so impossible sometimes without these emotional tools.
Yes, this is absolutely critical. It links the emotional mess directly to what's happening physically in the brain. Alcohol literally physically alters the brain chemistry. And here's the kicker. It actually starts to remove the capacity to enjoy normal everyday things.
It creates a void. Yeah.
A biological void, exactly. The dopamine pathways, the reward system, it gets completely scrambled. So you end up with this massive emotional deficit.
Right.
And that leads to profound hopelessness, which just fuels more heavy drinking, often long after the drinking itself has stopped providing any real pleasure or relief at all.
So just white-knuckling it, just abstaining against that altered brain state.
It's almost set up for failure, unless, and this is the key, unless you actively introduce new, constructive emotional tools to fill that void and basically rewire things.
Okay, that's a perfect segue because the fight isn't just against the bottle, is it? It's against that whole emotional and biological fallout that makes normal life feel, well, fundamentally unsatisfying or even unbearable. If emotion is the problem, then introspection and action have to be the solution.
Precisely.
Okay, so we've established that the unchecked emotion, especially anger turning into resentment, that's the real danger zone. The solution then, it seems, demands this kind of radical self-honesty, which brings us to what you might call the centerpiece of emotional recovery work, the inventory mindset. You hear this called the fourth step sometimes in recovery circles. And the point isn't shame, right? It's not about beating yourself up.
Not at all. It's framed as a rigorous, searching audit, looking for the core drivers of our unhappiness, particularly those self-centered drivers like anger and resentment.
The older texts can be pretty blunt about this, can't they? Describing the person struggling with addiction as self-centered in the extreme.
They are blunt, yeah. And we need to be clear what that means. It's not necessarily about being selfish, like, hogging all the cookies.
Right.
It means being trapped entirely inside your own perspective, your own feelings, your own needs, your own view of things often completely uninterested in real change unless it feels absolutely necessary just to stay alive.
And the inventory is the tool that kind of forces us to finally look beyond that narrow perspective.
Exactly. It forces us to confront that self-centeredness and find the sometimes difficult truth about ourselves.
And the really painful bit for many people is that realization you mentioned earlier, that the suffering, the internal chaos, it didn't stop when the drinking stopped. Sometimes it even got
It
worse.
often does, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they'd only treated the symptom, the drinking itself, but not the underlying emotional and, you might say, spiritual disease, which is often described as self-will run riot.
Self will run riot, meaning,
Meaning still trying to fix everything themselves, run the whole show, based purely on their own desires and perspective, still full of self-pity, convinced the world is wrong, and dripping with resentment. The inventory demands we shift that focus, look away from how the world has wronged us, and look squarely at our own internal reactions and contributions.
okay, let's dig into those inner workings then. What fuels that destructive anger? Where do these feelings, the rage, the jealousy, the desire for revenge, where do they actually come from according to this recovery framework?
Well, the idea is that they flare up when the human being becomes, and this is a quote, a battleground for the instincts.
A battleground for the
Right.
instincts.
Yeah. We're all born with powerful natural instincts, right? The drive for security, for possessions, for sex, for status or prestige, for control. These instincts aren't inherently bad,
Okay.
but
Huh.
when we try to impose them unreasonably on other people, when our drive for security makes us controlling or our drive for prestige makes us step on others, well, conflict is the guaranteed result.
So it's the collision, my self-will crashing into someone else's self-will.
Exactly. That collision produces those really potent destructive emotions.
Yeah.
The anger, the jealousy, the desire for revenge. It's the fallout from demanding the world conform to our instincts.
So the anger isn't just random noise. It's the frustration that boils up when my desire for, say, total control or my need for everyone to admire me gets blocked by the simple fact that other people exist and have their own wills.
Precisely. And then often underneath that surface layer of reactive anger, you find something even more corrosive, something deeper.
Which is
Shame. Yeah. Deep down, there's often this feeling of being fundamentally flawed, worthless, maybe just deeply embarrassed about who you are. And the biggest fear driving that shame is rejection.
the fear of being found out.
Absolutely. The terror that if people knew your failures or your real motives or your secrets, they'd cast you out. So the core of shame is secrecy,
Right.
which is why often the advice for starting this self-audit, this inventory, is simply to begin by listing the things you've kept secret. Those secrets, they're like the anchor points for shame, and they actively block real self-honesty, connection, and emotional stability.
That really changes the perspective on the inventory, doesn't it? It starts looking less like a moral checklist and more like an emotional and psychological excavation designed specifically to break down that secrecy and isolation.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
Take that drive for prestige or control we mentioned. Doesn't matter if someone's trying to run a small sewing circle or rule at the international conference table, as one text puts it. If that need for prestige is totally out of control, it inevitably makes other people suffer. They feel used or manipulated, and eventually they revolt against that control.
Which just creates more conflict.
Exactly. This relentless pursuit of dominion, of being top dog, it's a subtle but incredibly potent form of self-will. And it just obliterates any chance of inner peace, of serenity. It generates conflict purely because you're trying to bend reality and other people to fit your demands.
So when you move towards the next phase, sometimes called the fifth step, admitting the exact nature of your shortcomings to someone else, the focus shifts again, right? From just listing events to looking at the internal reality of the denial. What kinds of questions help uncover that emotional denial?
Yeah, the preparation for that step involves asking some really probing questions. Questions designed to expose where we're living a lie, maybe even lying to ourselves. Like, in what ways have I actually denied my true feelings? Or maybe even acted against my feelings just to please someone else or avoid conflict. Or a really critical one, where is my life fundamentally out of balance because of my own actions?
Okay.
The goal is to pinpoint exactly where we've failed to live up to our own personal values, because that mismatch is often the direct source of that profound sense of embarrassment about ourselves, that shame.
So it's less a list of sins against some external code and more like a shameful events inventory.
Yeah.
looking at moments where we feel we fell short of our own standards, and that's why we carry regret or embarrassment.
Exactly right. The whole process is framed much more around truth and learning than it is about moral judgment or just tallying up abstract wrongs. It lets us uncover the reality of the past and the present, not just what we did, but the motives behind what we did, so that genuine, realistic change can actually happen. It involves accepting, that we're limited human beings, we make mistakes, and it's only through that kind of radical self-honesty that we can start to feel okay with ourselves, maybe even lovable and forgivable in our own eyes.
But what about the really tricky stuff? The anger and resentment that are so subtly hidden, masked by rationalization, that alcoholic thinking that just keeps protecting the self-centered view.
Yeah.
How does this inventory process cut through that?
Rationalization. Yeah. That's defined in the text as the perverse wish to hide a bad motive underneath a good one.
Hiding a bad motive under a good one.
It's that uncanny ability we have to justify actions that were fundamentally harmful or just plain wrong because, well, in our minds, we had a good reason. Or we tell ourselves we did.
Right.
And the daily maintenance part of this, sometimes called Step 10, the ongoing inventory, that's crucial for catching these little self-deceptions in real time.
Can you give a really concrete example of that? That subtle hidden resentment dressed up as something noble? Because I think that's where the real poison often hides.
Okay, yeah. Think about this. You might genuinely believe you were just giving constructive criticism to a colleague, right? Because, they needed help or needed some direction.
Okay, sounds reasonable.
But if you look really honestly at the underlying motive, maybe you realize the real reason was just you wanted to win a pointless argument, or you wanted to feel superior for a moment.
Ouch.
Or another classic, telling yourself you're trying to help others understand him, talking about someone else, when the real hidden motive is actually to feel better about yourself by tearing that other person down. It's this really subtle, slippery kind of self-righteousness. And it has to be spotted, admitted, and corrected, ideally daily, because that is emotional poison. That's what keeps the anger and resentment simmering away while you're busy telling yourself what a good, helpful person you are.
It's fascinating. So the goal isn't necessarily to become some saint who never feels irritated. Not at all.
But to stop justifying the destructive actions that come from that irritation and start holding ourselves accountable for the motive behind the action.
That's the absolute essence of self-honesty in this context. And, you generally can't reach this level of honesty completely on your own, in a vacuum.
Right. You need someone else.
Yeah. It usually requires help, a sponsor, a mentor, maybe a therapist, someone to help you really explore your feelings and motives honestly. You need support to break free from those old patterns of emotional denial that got so ingrained during active addiction, where maybe you constantly hid your feelings or downplayed really serious situations or just obsessively focused on everything and everyone but yourself.
Okay, so we've gone through the diagnosis, the need for this rigorous self-audit to find the real source of the anger and resentment. Now we need to pivot, right? Move from that potentially painful realization phase into practical action. How do we constructively process that angry energy?
Yeah. It feels like the journey really shifts gear at the point where we stop just analyzing our flaws and actually start asking for help to change them.
That action phase is absolutely critical.
Yeah.
If you only identify the problems but never move to action, you just end up stuck in shame, maybe feeling even worse.
Right.
So that's often called Step 7, asks us to humbly ask him to remove our shortcomings. Him referring to a higher power as you understand it. This really marks a shift, abandoning those limited goals, like maybe just not drinking today, and moving towards something bigger.
Yeah.
Radical acceptance, genuine spiritual and emotional growth. And humility is the key ingredient here. It's non-negotiable.
Humility meaning?
Meaning accepting reality on reality's terms, not demanding it conform to our will. Without at least some degree of that humility, the sources are clear. No one struggling with addiction can stay sober long-term, but, and this is important, unless they develop much more than just the bare minimum needed for sobriety, they still won't find real happiness or serenity. Just being dry isn't the goal.
What about the immediate payoff, though? Going through that difficult, sometimes painful inventory process we talked about, what are the psychological benefits right away?
Well, the fifth step, that act of sharing your inventory honestly with another person, it's often described as the very first taste of true kinship with man and God.
True kinship.
Yeah. It immediately starts to dissolve that crippling sense of isolation that often fuels addiction. The person finally gets some honesty and realism about ourselves, as the text says. And that opens the door to real connection, emotional maturity, just lifting the burden of all those secrets. It's huge. It allows the individual to finally start breathing again, psychologically speaking.
Okay, so the inventory is done, the secrets are out, you've seen where your own actions, often driven by anger or self-pity, caused harm. The next big action step seems to be clearing that backlog, right? Making amends, actually going to the people you harmed.
Exactly. Amends, often step 9. And this requires a lot of, well, emotional intelligence and careful thought. The texts say it requires good judgment, timing, courage, and prudence.
So it's not just blurting things out.
Definitely not. The core purpose of making amends is taking responsibility for your part in a past conflict or a damaged relationship. And, importantly, extending hope for something new, something better, both for yourself and maybe for the other person.
And it's really focused on your part, not theirs.
Absolutely critical. This is not about blaming them or explaining why they were wrong too, or trying to fix them. It's solely focused on admitting what you did, the harm you caused. It's a powerful act of taking proactive accountability. And sometimes, people you thought were your enemies can actually become allies or even friends through this kind of radical honesty.
Now, what about those resentments that are really deep, maybe towards someone who's passed away or someone you just absolutely cannot contact? The sources mention a sort of counterintuitive practice for that, don't they?
Yes, a very powerful one. The practice of actively, intentionally praying for those people you resent.
Praying for people you resent. That sounds hard.
It is hard, but it's fundamentally a psychological tool, maybe dressed in spiritual language. For example, the instruction might be to pray daily for, say, every person one hated for not wanting me, or maybe praying for an ex-partner and every single person they flirted with that drove you crazy.
Wow.
It sounds strange, but it's a practical, physical, mental exercise. It forces you to overcome the destructive emotion by intentionally shifting your focus, moving away from self-pity, blame, obsessive thinking, and deliberately cultivating goodwill, even if you don't feel it at first. It literally breaks the mental loop of victimhood and resentment.
That deliberate shift, it immediately starts to dismantle that self-centered loop that fuels the anger in the first place.
Exactly. And the ultimate expression of redirecting that energy constructively is often seen as carrying the message to others, what's called the 12th step work. It forces an outward focus.
Right, helping others.
Yeah, that outward focus is seen as the direct antidote to the inward-looking, self-centered nature of the addictive illness. The sources suggest that true happiness is never really found when you chase it directly. Instead, it turns out to be a byproduct, an extra dividend, they call it, that comes from giving freely, without demanding anything in return. This service breaks the isolation, transforms that corrosive, destructive internal energy into constructive external action. It's through giving that we really move towards emotional and spiritual connection.
Okay, so cleaning up the past wreckage is vital, but we can't just do that once. We need tools for managing the present, right? The day-to-day emotional turbulence. That brings us to the daily disciplines, like the ongoing inventory, step 10, and things like prayer and meditation.
Absolutely. Step 10, which involves continuing to take personal inventory, usually daily, combined with regular meditation and prayer, is described as the unshakable foundation for life.
Unshakable foundation.
Yeah. It requires daily, non-negotiable discipline. The idea is to review your day, maybe in the evening. Quickly acknowledge where you fell short. If you made a mistake or felt a flare of resentment, admit it promptly. Maybe make an immediate amends if needed, and ask for help, for relief from those continuing shortcomings that cause pain. It's about keeping the emotional slate clean, preventing new resentments from taking root and festering.
And modern psychology really backs this up, doesn't it? This idea of daily self-monitoring and mindfulness, linking it directly to healing the parts of the brain that addiction messes with.
Completely validates it.
Yeah.
The importance of mindful awareness, what the text might call dispassionate self-observation, is huge. It involves using conscious mental effort, real mental force, to fundamentally change those deeply ingrained dysfunctional emotional responses.
How does that work neurobiologically?
Well, that conscious effort actually activates the prefrontal cortex. That's our brain's self-regulation system, the executive function center. And that's the very system that often gets impaired by years of addiction. So practices like mindfulness and meditation, when you use them rigorously, they become the tools that stop us from constantly running away from the uncomfortable present moment.
Which is where the feelings actually are.
Exactly, where our true feelings exist, unprocessed.
So changing these automatic emotional reactions, like sliding off the handle, it actually requires us to intentionally use mental force to build new pathways in the brain.
Precisely. You're actively rewiring. And it changes the meaning of difficult emotional experiences, even simple acts like, say, kneeling in prayer. If you do it not out of fear or desperation, but maybe just asking to be useful or helpful today,
Hmm.
that fundamentally changes the meaning of the physical act itself.
You're not kneeling in defeat anymore.
Right. You're kneeling in commitment, maybe. By intentionally focusing our attention and acting as if the change we desire has already happened, we start building new spiritual and emotional habits. And these habits directly shift our emotional reality, gradually replacing that volatile, reactive anger with more thoughtful, constructive action.
Okay, let's talk about the payoff then. After doing all this hard work, confronting the anger, making amends, committing to the daily disciplines, how does the emotional landscape actually change? What does this new state feel like compared to the old turmoil?
The result of this recovery process is that a stronger, more integrated inner self starts to emerge. And this translates pretty directly into healthier relationships, more reciprocal relationships,
Reciprocal meaning.
meaning relationships where both people feel safe enough to be vulnerable, to trust each other, to express their true feelings openly without fear of explosion or abandonment. The person is no longer constantly performing, or desperately seeking approval from outside to try and manage the distress inside.
And what about that power dynamic? Especially that crippling fear of what other people think, which seems to fuel so much self-pity and resentment.
Yeah, that shifts dramatically.
Yeah.
Sobriety, achieved through this kind of work, enables what the texts call a true sense of personal power.
Okay, but power not in the old controlling sense.
Exactly. This isn't power over other people or the world. It's the internal freedom, the internal power to express your feelings honestly, to assert your needs appropriately, without agonizing endlessly about what others will think or how they might react. In effect, the person grows up emotionally. They move from what's often described as a childlike state, demanding the world meet their needs, to a more adult state, finally learning that hard-won maturity of accepting the things in life you simply cannot change.
So the serenity people talk about, it's not just passive resignation. It sounds more like an active spiritual control over the one thing you can control, your own thoughts.
That's precisely the core spiritual goal described, controlling external circumstances indirectly, by first controlling your internal thoughts. The commitment becomes, as one source puts it, thinking peace and contentment and goodwill to all.
Thinking peace.
Yeah. The ultimate freedom comes when you realize that destructive emotion is a primary cause of your own mental and physical suffering, and that you actually possess the power to starve that emotional disease by rigorously choosing what you allow your mind to dwell on.
And what happens to fear? Because fear seems to be underneath so much of the anger, the control issues, the obsessions.
Well, the idea is that realizing a connection to something larger than yourself, call it wisdom, a higher power, your deeper conscience, that connection fundamentally starts to remove that deep-seated existential fear.
Okay.
And this leads to a profound sense of calm, of serenity. It allows you to remain remarkably undisturbed by all the little occurrences that used to vex and annoy us constantly. You move away from that frantic, fearful need to control everything and the inevitable rage when that control fails.
So it's actually moving from a position of weakness, really being a slave to your emotions and impulses, to a place of genuine, integrated strength.
Absolutely. And paradoxically, this reliance, this dependence on something greater than your own ego, that becomes the chief source of true strength. It's not seen as weakness at all. It's accessing real power. Power that allows the individual, as one text strikingly puts it, to match calamity with serenity.
Match calamity with serenity.
Wow, it's a transformative experience. It replaces that feeling of just being pushed around by fate, that dull submission to circumstance, with what's called enthusiastic gladness. You become an active, engaged participant in your own life, not just a passive victim reacting to things.
And that brings us back to that fascinating idea the world is a mirror.
Yes. The world is our kaleidoscope, is how one source describes it. And the changing patterns of colors we see are just these exquisitely adjusted reflections of our own ever-moving thoughts.
So we keep trying to rearrange the colors outside.
Right. We try to change the external circumstances to stop feeling angry or cold. But the consistent teaching here is you can't directly choose your circumstances most of the time. But you can choose your thoughts. And by choosing your thoughts, you indirectly but surely begin to shape the circumstances that surround you, or at least how you experience them. #outro.
Okay, so let's circle all the way back to that listener's question we started with. Is it okay to be angry in sobriety?
Hmm.
The answer, really distilled from all this material, seems to be yes, anger itself is a normal, unavoidable human emotion, but it's the unmanaged resentment that's the anger left to fester, the anger used to justify self-pity, the anger that rationalizes self-will that's the fatal danger we need to watch out for.
Exactly.
And these sophisticated tools we've talked about, from the inventory onwards, they're designed to shift that destructive, inward-looking, self-centered energy into constructive outward action and rigorous internal accountability. And serenity, happiness. They arrive almost as a surprising but profound side effect of that shift.
Beautifully put, yeah. Before recovery, the individual is just constantly driven by these inner forces, unmanaged instincts, deep fear that ultimately lead towards terror, isolation, and self-destruction. The huge transformation we've been exploring is that realization that destructive emotion is one of the primary causes of disease, both mental and physical. And the freedom comes when you grasp that, even with evil, as one text says, there are ways of living that must lead to good. And that serving the highest principle, whether that's conscience, honesty, love, God asked it, it stops feeling like a burden, like a yoke you have to bear. It replaces that dull submission with a genuine, enthusiastic gladness.
We talked about how often we try to change things outside ourselves. Fix the irritating boss, change the unfair partner, find a better commute, hoping that'll fix the anger inside.
The external fix.
Yeah. But the wisdom running through all this material consistently points the other way. We can't fundamentally change our circumstances, or at least our experience of them, until we change the way we think about them.
Right. Which leads us to maybe a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on today based on this deep dive.
Okay.
It's this. What resentment are you carrying around today, right now? Even a small one. Are you willing to just name it, just acknowledge it to yourself? And maybe more importantly, what single constructive action might follow if you simply stopped the rationalization, stopped the story that justifies holding on to it? This whole life-changing path, it really starts with just asking those simple, honest questions. What do I think? What do I feel? What is my truth right here, right now?